Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Ross. I'm the strategic advisor here at Ecopia for the public sector. Prior to my time here at Ecopia, I spent 28 years in government here in Minnesota. And most recently, that time was spent as a geographic information officer for the state of Minnesota. Of course, we're talking about data today and specifically how high resolution data can help you or your organization not only in understanding where the climate vulnerabilities might be, but more than that, informing better decision making as it relates to how you might plan, how you might fund, and how you might build toward resilience for both the natural and human built environments. We have two speakers joining us today, and they're going to provide not only some background on climate resilience and the types of things we have to deal with, but where we can have some examples about where geospatial is helping organizations to do just that. Let me introduce our speakers today. Brandon Pellin is our Senior Director here at Ecopia for the public sector and international development. Brandon leads the development of Ecopia's AI's North American public sector markets. Brandon has a master's degree that he obtained from the International Business in the Richard Ivey School of Business in Toronto, Canada. He also holds a master's in international management from the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. Our other speaker today is Abigail Kahalik. Abigail is the Senior Director of Channel Partnerships here at Ecopia. She works closely with the state transportation authorities and helps them with their safety and infrastructure growth goals. In addition to this, she supports Ecopia's aerial imagery to ensure the public sector clients have access to the most current and high resolution data in a seamless manner. So Abby and Brandon, thanks for joining today. I'm going to use Abby's short name, by the way. Brandon, let's get started with you. You've been working closely with governments all across the nation and planning organization and others in that environmental sector to help them understand how leveraging geospatial data can help them be more informed, both in terms of decision making and understanding risk related to the climate changes that we're experiencing. Tell us a bit more about that.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you everyone so much for attending today. Really looking forward to the engaging discussion and hopefully some good questions that will follow up at the end. Before I kind of dive into the subject matter, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, I wanted to take a second just to introduce the company a little bit and provide you guys a little bit of context in terms of, what we're doing in the geospatial domain and kind of make sure everyone's on the same playing field before we really start diving into the problems and how we're addressing them. So a little bit about Ecopia. I always think it's important to kind of go back to our roots because it helps us really build the foundation for where we are today. So Ecopia is a relatively young company, started about 10 years ago, or I should say commercialized about 10 years ago following some PhD research with the mission of leveraging artificial intelligence to transform pictures and imagery of our Earth into high resolution vector maps. So big picture item that started with a concept and has really grown and blossomed into a leading cutting edge geospatial data provider around the world. So the progression started off with focusing on building footprints. And one of the aspects that makes Ecopia unique is, yes, we are an AI company, but ultimately the root of what we want to achieve is maintaining the accuracy of a GIS professional. So everything we do, we want to make sure that it's not a sacrifice on quality. We're essentially leveraging technology to help make the process more efficient, but we don't want to sacrifice on what people are used to. And we think that it's so important to maintain those strong qualities of data as we progress. So over the years, essentially what we've done is an iterative approach to data development. Starting off, you can see the progression in terms of 2016 even to 2018, where we mapped all of Australia in a period of 6 months, about 16 million structures, followed by the same amount of area being continental United States, but 169 million buildings in the same amount of time. So it speaks to the iterative approach to data development and also kind of understanding of how AI has progressed. But more importantly, where we're at today is how we've leveraged this technology to streamline data extraction into both natural and man-made features. And ultimately, what this has enabled us to realize is the first U.S. nationwide 3D land cover map. And a lot of what we're talking about today is going to be leveraging those data products and how they can solve or help address some of the most critical problems that we're facing today, and also how these data layers can be included as part of funding applications to help sustain your geospatial data programs. So in terms of who we're working with and the mapping that we're doing, Ecopia has worked in over 100 countries around the world. But what really is unique about our approach is effectively what we're trying to do is transition the data narrative from geospatial data as a service to geospatial data as a product, whereby we want to create efficiencies in data creation so that they can be leveraged across verticals. You can see the list of groups that we work with, from everything from civil engineering through to insurance. And the backbone of what really Ecopia focuses on is the public sector. And ultimately, that's where our conversation is going to be today, and specifically how the public sector can take advantage of not just our land cover data products, but also our transportation and polyline representations of geometry. But ultimately, those are just the core sets. I think most of the people on this call have a decent understanding of what Ecopia products look like today. For us, what we want to jump into and dive into is why. Why are we doing this? How does this fit into the world today? And what is the bigger picture as it relates to geospatial data? So by all means, there's no way that we could ever cover every single topic in terms of addressing the primary problems, but we're going to focus in on some key themes. We're going to structure this in a way that it's tailored to specific high priority issues that we're facing today. So I'm going to start off with flooding. So flooding is not just about coastal surge. This isn't just about the effects that we're seeing of hurricanes. This is also about inland flooding. We've seen some devastation. Most recently we saw what happened in terms of Hurricane Ian. If you look back just a few years ago, Hurricane Harvey, we're talking about over $100 billion in damage, not to even mention the loss of life. This year there was also additional flooding that we saw in Vermont. It just continues to plague us. And problematically here is the concept that we've kind of been stuck in this iterative approach to dealing with these problems after the fact. Where geospatial data can come into play is addressing and understanding the problem at the onset. So just to quantify this from a very high level, one of the things we wanted to look at was what is that community that's most at risk across the US? And just within a 1 mile buffer on that coastline, we see about 8 million structures. More importantly, though, is the structures that are in there are part of the cities that effectively run our economy. You're talking about Manhattan, you see Miami, San Francisco, all of these primary major metros where there's a huge center of our population, but also economic and social resources. Ultimately, that threat is significant, but it's very important for us to be able to understand and quantify it. Wildfires, this is another issue that clearly facing. The devastation here is not just about the fire and destruction, but also the impact that we're seeing in terms of air quality. Photo on the right is actually taken this past year in New York City, and it just demonstrates the haze and the fact that, yes, I know during COVID, a lot of us did wear masks and whatnot, but this is actually dealing with air quality. This wasn't necessarily in terms of a COVID photo. Extreme heat and urban heat islands. Ultimately, this is what I would classify as the largest problem facing major metros across the US, not just those in the South. And the reason for this is extreme heat is the #1 cause of weather-related deaths in the United States. It beats any other natural disaster. And, I say beats in the sense of not positively, certainly negatively. But the challenge is that oftentimes what we're seeing is the effects of urban heat are concentrated in the communities that are most at risk. So ultimately, what we're trying to do is understand this and be able to map it out. And this is where geospatial data layers can come into play in terms of addressing the why. I'm going to pass it over to Abby, who's going to talk a little bit this from relating to the transportation side and mobility sector in our communities.
Thanks, Brandon. Totally. So another change we're seeing that's seriously impacting our communities is the rapid growth in population. So over the next 30 years, populations are expected to grow 25% to nearly 10 billion people in 2050, right? So more interesting than that, though, is how those populations are migrating to city centers. In the 1980s, only 39% of the population lived in urban centers. And we fast forward to today, 55% of the population is actually living in urban centers. And it's predicted that, again, by 2050, 68% of the world is going to be living in cities. So when we couple this migration over to cities with population growth, that means that nearly 7 billion people are going to be living in cities within the next 30 years. And that's an increase in over 50% in capacity. We're already really starting to feel the impacts of these changes across the United States. Specific to the transportation sector, this is kind of showing up, this increase in population is kind of showing up in increases in congestion. We have record high fatalities right now. We're seeing the amplification of inequities. And of course, infrastructure is degrading. So obviously, as more people flock to cities in search of economic opportunities and a better quality of life, the demand for transportation services is just going to continue to surge. And what this has happened is this has resulted in crowded transportation facilities, longer commute times, and generally an overall strain on existing transportation infrastructure. Urban areas are grappling with the challenge of efficiently moving people and goods, and that's leading to gridlock during peak hours. This increase in congestion not only diminishes the quality of life of residents, but it's also posing economic challenges by hindering timely movement of goods and services, which is in the end has impacts on our economic potential as a nation, but also it's reducing air quality, which causes negative health impacts and environmental degradation. Now we're also seeing increases in distracted roadway users. And of course, there's also been the preference change from smaller, lighter vehicles to heavier, larger vehicles that are much more lethal when involved in crashes. And so when you pair this with the increase in population, with many more vehicles, pedestrians, cyclists, and so forth sharing limited road space, the risks associated with commuting are just rising. And as a result of this, unfortunately, we have record high fatalities in the US, with over 42,000 being reported in 2022, and those are fatal crashes. So the impact of these fatalities, of course, extends beyond the immediate loss of life, which is already super tragic, affecting communities and placing, again, an economic burden on society through healthcare and legal costs. And then these two things have also brought to light the fact that impoverished citizens are the ones who are bearing the brunt of these negative impacts. Citizens who live in low-income neighborhoods are much more likely to be subject to the health burden of air pollution due to their proximity to air pollution sources like factories, major roadways, and ports with diesel truck operations. And then when we look at who's walking and biking as their primary means of transportation, that's typically those who are low income, which means with the increases in pedestrian fatalities, statistically, these vulnerable populations would be at higher risk. And then this disparity in access to efficient and safe transportation options is just going to further marginalize vulnerable populations, hindering their access to education, to healthcare, to employment opportunities, which again just reduces the economic potential of the nation. And then, of course, the surge in population and urbanization places pressure on existing infrastructure as it wasn't created to support such demand. So that means that the roads, bridges, sidewalks, public transportation systems are experiencing wear and tear due to this higher demand and, of course, congestion. And that, of course, compromises safety as well and is also necessitating the need for significant investment in upgrades. So I'll leave it now I'll bring it back to Dan to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Abby and Brandon. You know, as you were talking about that, it really made me think about not only the vulnerabilities, but the challenges that go with them. and how organizations must think about that and plan for those now with this changing environment. Can you two share some thoughts about what are the solutions and what should organizations be thinking about in terms of how they might leverage geospatial data and what those next steps might be?
Yeah. So ultimately, I think when we look at the scenario here, these are massive micro problems that are affecting communities in different ways across not just the United States, but the world. And ultimately, this is where the concept of taking a holistic view at this, and more importantly, understanding where does geospatial data fit into the mix. And ultimately, this is where Ecopia is really trying to change the narrative. We're trying to talk not just about data as a source of information, but data as a tool. And understanding how that tool can be leveraged is both powerful in terms of communicating the need for additional resources for geospatial data development, but also articulating to people outside this industry why it's important and the benefits of having good geospatial data can be to not just local communities, but general governance. So with that, is essentially what we put together is the concept of a climate resiliency strategy. And ultimately, I want to frame this under the scope that, yes, certainly this fits into climate resiliency, but really this is a lot more than that. This is effectively a strategy catered to understanding the future of our communities, the futures of our society, the development and modernization of communities. And with that, we're going to build off the tone of Ecopia being an AI company and leveraging something that is a public source tool that has really brought AI into the forefront over the last, let's call it 12 months or so. I can't remember exactly when ChatGPT went public. But ultimately, a climate resiliency strategy is framed much better by them than the way I would articulate this. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Climate resiliency strategy refers to a comprehensive and integrated set of actions, policies, and measures designed to help individuals, communities, and ecosystems adapt and withstand the impact of climate change. It involves proactive planning, risk assessment, and management aimed at enhancing the capacity of natural and human systems to cope with the changing climate conditions. And frankly, essentially what they're articulating here is how do we build enduring capacity so that as the human scope or human world continues to develop, how do we integrate that in a way that is more suitable to our natural landscape? And ultimately, it's framed into 6 categories. And these 6 categories are important to understand because ultimately we want to be able to frame that into a geospatial strategy. So we go from assessing climate risks and vulnerabilities to doing a risk assessment and vulnerability mapping, developing adaptation plans to land use planning and management, building resilient infrastructure to infrastructure planning and design, protecting ecosystems to emergency response and preparedness, enhancing community resilience to natural resource management, investing in research and development to community engagement and awareness. Ultimately, these themes are buckets where, I put in here key terms for funding applications because ultimately that is a theme of this presentation. It's about saying there are significant resources catered to these initiatives. It's just about making or perhaps demonstrating the value of geospatial as it fits into it. So we're going to kind of take it back to where we started. I referenced the concept of flooding and how that fits into the mix here. So ultimately, when we look at flood forecasting, or even flood modeling, 2 of the primary emphasis in terms of understanding water runoff are your impervious surfaces and your other natural vegetation covers, otherwise known as water runoff coefficients that are labeled onto those land use types. Without having a detailed analysis, it's very difficult to understand, without having that data in addition to elevation data sets, it's very difficult to understand the impact that you could see from not just, your 5-year storm or your 100-year storm, but what about the 500-year storm, the improbable, the stuff that we've seen happen more frequently over the past couple of years. And we're actually going to talk about that a little bit more detailed in terms of a review of a situation in Texas. Wildfires. It's about understanding the different types of layers, understanding each fuel type that is within inherent in terms of these different types of vegetations. It's also about understanding where people are in these communities. One of the groups that we've been working with and talking with for quite a while is the state of California. And historically, their groups have relied on open source information. Problem was, during the last 2 years ago, the major wildfire season, they realized that a lot of those data sets were out of date. And the information they were relying on, in fact, was not information that should be relied on. And ultimately, this comes into the concept of education. And as an industry, we need to do a better job of understanding why the value of having good data is so important. Urban heat. I alluded to this earlier, and I am also going to give another example of this, but ultimately, when we look at reducing the impacts of urban heat, in order to understand which areas are most vulnerable, there's a direct correlation between vegetation canopy coverage and impervious surfaces, because ultimately a higher level of impervious surfaces is going to lead to an increased temperature within those communities. How are you supposed to do this or identify it down to a granular level of property specific if you're leveraging historically available land cover information that's done at a 10 or 30 meter scope? You know, all of those data sets are inherently so broad that it's very difficult to be able to identify where you're supposed to allocate resources in terms of modernizing existing infrastructure, or perhaps even the development of perhaps tree initiatives or tree planting changes, or even monitoring where to put up infrastructure to help support those communities. Without access to good information, it's not possible. Land use planning and management. This one kind of speaks for itself. Without understanding the environment of today, or even the environment of a few years ago, how are you supposed to understand how a new community development is going to impact perhaps a natural wetland that has historically been there for hundreds of years, and a critical population perhaps of salmon is flowing through there? Ultimately, all of these different pieces of information come together to paint a picture. Emergency response and preparedness. Another example that we're going to dive into a little bit in terms of an actual case study, but ultimately, when we look at scenarios where geospatial data or even high accuracy geospatial data is needed most, it's the scenarios that you plan for, but you never really want to deal with. So if we talk about, major hurricanes, tornadoes, and you're having in a scenario where you need to route evacuation vehicles, imagine you don't have an updated road data set. Or, for example, maybe you don't understand if your bridges are going to be underwater. That seems crazy to say out loud, but ultimately that is the state for a lot of communities. And that's actually the situation that we're helping to solve for the state of Texas. So ultimately, these problems are things that, honestly, if you were speaking with people publicly about outside of our industry, they'd say, there's no way that's possible. But the frank matter is, there's been a gap in terms of this concept of infrastructure development, but also understanding the environment of today. And that's where these two come together, especially in terms of emergency response and preparedness. Natural resource management, in terms of just keeping up with time here, ultimately this flows into the general concept of what the conversation I was talking about earlier, but it's essentially understanding the impact of human populations on the natural vegetation, natural areas that have been there for millions of years effectively. And as we change these areas, there's detrimental impacts. Now, all of those impacts can be mitigated, and frankly, I think it's naive to say that there won't be continued development. But we have a responsibility to also understand that impact so that we can mitigate against it, and also we can build suitable infrastructure so it minimizes the impact of our expansion. Now, frankly, these are all topics that are mentioned broadly. Now, it's important for us, though, to be able to communicate how geospatial data fits into that mix, right? And that's where the data comes into play, in that it's informing how natural resource management should happen. You're identifying those areas of high risk. You're identifying sensitive ecosystems. You're identifying how they've changed over the past 20, 50 years. This is how we mitigate for the future. And lastly, what I think is arguably the most important is community engagement and awareness. At the end of the day, geospatial data can paint a pretty clear picture. And for anyone, outside of our industry, I think it's very easy for us to, explain our jobs as making maps. And you know what? Why not lean into that? Sure, we do a heck of a lot more, and the data set is valued to a lot more than just some pretty picture. But frankly speaking, you can build a heck of a ton of adoption and a lot of interest in the work that you're doing if you can communicate using these data sets and these maps. And ultimately, this is going to be an invaluable tool in terms of getting adoption and also in terms of getting funding, because the people who are allocating resources to geospatial often do not come from a geospatial data background. They don't know the difference between vector and raster data in most cases. They don't understand the value of having, sidewalk polygons and inventory of road networks, or, the geometry of a 2D or 3D building footprint. But they do understand that if you show them a map and you show them a water body and you show them a flood scenario and it's going to affect the community, that's going to resonate with them. And that's going to tell them we need to invest more resources in this, because it's going to cater where those funding dollars are going to go. So what I want to do now is to take this a little bit deeper. As we talked about, we're going to, review some actual case studies. We're going to actually talk about how this is being leveraged in certain communities across the United States, and specifically, I'm going to talk about the state of Texas. I decided to choose Texas, one, because it's a group that we've been working with and have a lot of experience with, but also it's a community that has been devastated by natural disasters over the last, let's say 10 to 20 years. So what we're going to do is try to understand how geospatial data fits into vulnerability mapping, how it fits into land use planning and management, infrastructure planning and design, and ultimately how it can save lives. But to just paint the picture of why it's so important, let's just talk about a few scenarios that have happened. Tropical Storm Allison, keep in mind this is a tropical storm, not even a hurricane. 22 deaths occurred during flooding caused by extreme rainfall. Now, relatively speaking, 22 deaths for a natural disaster is not tremendous. However, 19 were related to driving or walking through flood waters. Now, one death is too many. And so if we can understand areas that are flooded and that you should not be navigating people through, and even just having one data layer that could have saved one life, that's enough. Hurricane Ike, 2009, 100,000 homes had been flooded in Texas, and numerous boats were washed ashore. The city of Galveston was declared uninhabitable, and Houston imposed a week-long night curfew due to limited electrical power. Hurricane Harvey. NOAA estimates that the total damage of this hurricane was $125 billion. If you look a little bit more broadly, you can see the scope of this to actually be, some estimates are closer to $200 billion. Essentially, this is largely one of the most devastating storms that has ever hit in the United States. You had the greatest amount of precipitation that's ever fallen in an area by far, as you can see just from that one graph in front of you. Throughout Texas, approximately 336,000 people were without electricity and tens of thousands of houses required rescue. In addition to this, once again, these are still estimates, but approximately 1,800 people lost their lives. These are statistics that paint a pretty painful picture. And what's more painful is understanding just how significant the problems are and who's most at risk. And this is where geospatial data starts to come into the mix, and how as an industry we can work to not only identify solutions, but also identify where resources need to be allocated. So Ecopia has worked, we work with a variety of organizations, federal, state, local government. This particular project harnesses the power a power of data that was supplied to the Texas Water Development Board, specifically TexGIO, the Texas Geographic Information Office, in coordination with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. And what we did is we looked at the greater Houston metro area, which is an area about just over 12,000 square miles. Ecopia, we did our standard land cover mapping there, essentially leveraging the data set that was created. But more importantly, what we wanted to do was understand the spatial relationship between income, poverty, tree equity, and impervious surfaces. So why? Ultimately, I already talked about this. Impervious surfaces lead to the greatest likelihood of disaster and extreme precipitations, but it also has the greatest effect of urban heat. Now, the value of geospatial data is not unilaterally just one directional. You can't just expect one piece of data to paint a picture. Now, what you can do is leverage multiple sets of data to be able to start to map out the situation and in a way that starts to, as I said earlier, paint a picture. So what we did is we took our vector layers and then we layered that with publicly available census data, and we're able to extract a direct correlation between communities most at risk. And when I say most at risk, what I'm talking about is the lower income, visible minorities, people who are generally living in multi-unit housing. Ultimately, the takeaway from just having these basic layers is you're directly able to not only illustrate where, but you're able to quantify the inequity in this community. So what we see from this is essentially the bottom 20th percentile of median income had an average of 48% impervious land cover, while the top 20th percentile had an average of 36.5%. This is just in terms of their individual parcels in the census blocks. Now, that's a pretty resounding statistic, especially in the concept of understanding that urban heat is the #1 cause of weather-related deaths in the United States. This is a source of information that enables you to paint a picture on how we can solve problems. Let's take another example. This is a project that's being completed, the first phase 1 of the project in terms of a Streamflow 2 initiative, is understanding critical infrastructure across Texas. The phase 1 was an area of about 11 counties, the Austin district, where ultimately what they were trying to understand is the road network and bridge network across the community here. What was maintained by DEXDOT was about 18,000 linear miles of road because they're only focusing on the public right-of-way data. In terms of all Ecopia information, what you have is 38,000 miles of road extracted, not to mention the whole bridge network inventory. Now, what's even more frustrating and crazy about the situation is the current bridge inventory maintained by these groups does not have elevation data. So any flood forecasting, flood modeling did not historically take into account the elevation of bridges, which means depending on the rainfall and the water runoff, you could have bridges that were underwater. And frankly speaking, that's exactly what happened in several cases during these past natural disasters I talked about. And even more than that, this has actually caused loss of life due to emergency routing evacuation on roads that were flooded. So what did we look at? It's essentially, like I said, it's leveraging simple data sets, but extracting and delivering them in a way that enables you to do the work that's needed to be able to build a proper solution. So working alongside the Center for Water and Environment at the University of Texas, we essentially took our road polygons, our centerline data sets, and our bridge inventory, layered it with the data they had already collected in terms of their LiDAR data, and built our own, or corrected, I should say, their own elevation data sets. And essentially what this enables us to do is understand which critical infrastructure is most at risk during the 100-year, the 500-year, the major catastrophes, the major storms. And more importantly, it enables us to fix their data so that we can understand which roads are safe during emergency management scenarios. And what is the outcome of that? Saved lives. Without having an up-to-date road and bridge inventory, how are you supposed to understand where you're supposed to evacuate and route emergency vehicles? To me, these are very straightforward concepts. And frankly, as we talk about them out loud, I think that is adopted. But there needs to be a higher precedent in terms of educating people of why it's important to have access to this information and also maintain it. Abby, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
So I'm going to kind of continue, I guess, on the transportation maybe trend here, but also try to tie back to what I spoke to earlier, which was we're seeing a decrease in air quality because of congestion, a continuous decrease in road safety, and we're also worried about the growing harm of inequitable practices on our citizens. So I thought the sidewalk network analysis completed by CMAP, which was feasible because we created a statewide 40-feature transportation data set with the Illinois Department of Transportation, is really an excellent case to walk through. And so for the CMAP team, this network analysis of their sidewalks was really important to improve pedestrian infrastructure and achieve compliance with Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So back in 2016, they began their endeavor to understand the current state of pedestrian infrastructure in the 7-county and 284 municipality region that CMAP's responsible for. As you can understand, this is a very large area. And so scalability of the approach was always top of mind, as it's not that they just wanted to one-time understand what infrastructure looked like, although that was a priority, but they also had to track improvements as the city began to implement systems to make it more accessible to different modes. So the team first turned to an intersection density rating to quantify the walkability of their region. And in this workflow, you took the existing road centerline file, run a script to identify all the intersections in the road, and then rank that road's walkability based on the number of intersections. So the higher the number of intersections within a prescribed length, the assumption was the more walkable that area would be. So after completing this analysis, the team recognized this method was just missing far too much information and wasn't in line with their data standards. Just because a road intersects with another road doesn't mean that it's not well suited for walking, has pedestrian infrastructure by it, or, could be even measured as ADA compliant or not. They needed to know specifically where the roads and sidewalks work. So for that, they purchased near-map aerial imagery, and they commissioned a team of 10 staffers to look over all 3,000 square miles of the road data in the imagery and to update the metadata of that existing road centerline file as either having no sidewalk, sidewalk on one side of the road, or sidewalk on both sides of the roads. And so over the year, the team was able to fully code the road centerline file. You can see the results here in this final image on the right. And that, of course, was a monumental step for CMAP and allowed them to identify definitively where a sidewalk was or was not present. However, that process for creation was very labor intensive. It took 10 full-time staff 1 year to complete this analysis. And unfortunately, many agents wouldn't have 10 full-time staff available to do this kind of work. And even CMAP, which receives a lot of funding, couldn't replicate the activity at the annual/biannual desired cadence due to really the costs associated with it. So this data was super valuable. And so they had to look for an alternative that could get them the same insights they were receiving while also maintaining this up-to-date understanding of their infrastructure again, being able to give pedestrians access to complete networks and maintain ADA compliance. And so they went to the market to see there was a company, tool, solution they could use to achieve this efficiency while adhering to their accuracy standards. And since you're here today, you can guess where this is going. After many pilots and data evaluations, Ecopia was confirmed to be capable of extracting and updating the data while maintaining the same quality of manual engineers. So in 2022, we delivered the first sidewalk center line and edges with a width attribute vector file across their full 3,000 square mile area. And this is important because by enhancing CMAP's historic data set to now include the actual location of the sidewalks and the full digitizing of their geometries, as well as their width, really allows for a detailed inventory of their assets, which improves the network gap analysis that could be completed. And so with this full data set, you know exactly where gaps in pedestrian infrastructure lied and could cause safety issues as people needed to walk in vehicle lanes or make abrupt crossings. And then the widths of the sidewalks also enables the identification of the most egregious sidewalks, which would be under the 1990 4-foot ADA compliance mandate. Again, this is both an accessibility and a safety issue because, again, if you didn't have that 4-foot width, these people would likely be forced to enter the roadway if the sidewalk wasn't accommodating for their mobility device. So by identifying these zones, it's possible to prioritize the worst areas, which demonstrates to constituents really a continued effort to improve the pedestrian network in their region. And just quickly, I alluded to earlier that more than sidewalks were delivered to CMAP, and those were features like bike center lines you're seeing here, medians with and without canopy, crosswalks and their types, truncated dome locations, and that's just giving an even more detailed picture of what assets exist in a city that allow for non-automotive travel for both people with and without disabilities. And that provides a concrete understanding of, again, where gaps lie and how these MPOs and these states can expand their non-vehicular infrastructure to enable many more different modes of transportation. That's going to help with decreasing congestion, improving air quality throughout the city, and ensuring equitable options for all citizens.
Thanks for that, Abby. As you two were talking, those were some great examples about vulnerabilities, obviously. But more than that, how leveraging geospatial data can help organizations as they pursue their initiatives to help their environment, our environment, to become more resilient. Also, to help them meet their goals. As I was thinking about what you were saying, two challenges come to mind. Obviously, coming from state government, for me, funding to create geospatial data was always a challenge, always. But not only that, the time to create geospatial data in terms of weeks, months, years was also always a challenge. I know that recently the federal government has made some significant funding available. Can you two talk a little bit about what are some examples of funding that are available to organizations that they might be able to pursue?
Totally, Dan. As you said, there's been a breadth of funding. And of course, many use cases are just like really subject to these funds, but I'll focus on a couple that are going to extend over the next 3 years as the federal government recognizes the growing demands on the transportation authorities and really tie them into the climate resiliency so that we can kind of avoid those negative impacts if we're not adapting to them. So first, there's the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation grant. And the objective of this grant is to ensure surface transportation resilience to all those natural hazards that Brandon was speaking to: sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather, and of course, other natural disasters. And they want to support this with planning activities, resilience improvements, community resilience, and evacuation routes, and at-risk coastal infrastructure. And it's really divided into two project types. And that's it's again, following the same thing we're talking about today. So the first is the planning grants, and the second is the actual resiliency grants. And the planning grants are centered around creating a resiliency plan, which would focus on having a strong understanding of current assets and the implications of specific conditions in the future so that we can better plan for these natural disasters. Of course, a foundational map data set covering transportation assets and the natural environment would form the base of any kind of plan. So for example, as Brandon had discussed with Texas, Understanding the height of a bridge and then tracking the amount of precipitation in the case of an emergency can ensure that your evacuation plan takes into account what transportation routes are still functional and will ensure the safe travel of your citizens. Again, and so without that data, that plan isn't going to be as strong. And then you have that second category of resiliency grants that are focused on investing in infrastructure to help negate the negative impacts that you identified in your resiliency plan and really put that into action. And so this grant is unique in that it's part formula funding, which is about $1.45 billion a year. And then you have the other half that's competitive grants, which is $300 million a year. And you can see here most transportation authorities are able to apply for these grants. The next grant that is tied specifically to safety action plans. And we saw, again, this increase in roadway fatalities has actually made USDOT officially call this a crisis. And they're really adamant to fund change and improve safety for all users of the transportation system. Again, with that ultimate goal of achieving Vision Zero. And of course, the first step to achieving this is to develop the safety action plan, where a detailed understanding of the infrastructure to identify potential risks, and then determine, again, how to best avoid these risks and eliminate them. So that includes understanding, how are these intersections structured? Is there sidewalk continuity along the road? Are crosswalks present? Is there a right turn lane approaching the intersection? As we know, that really increases risk. And so once these items can be identified, then you can plan and accommodate for these risks and adapt the infrastructure to increase safety. And this data-driven focus is going to help ensure, again, that as programs go from this safety action plan stage to the implementation stage, which is the second category, you're maximizing the funding and its impact. And so for this grant specifically, it's not available at the state level, but of course, what it can do is help expand the coverage of detailed road data across the state, as MPOs and municipalities can cover the arterial roads, frequently not included in statewide extractions. And you can see here, this is a competitive grant released annually with over $1 billion allocated. And of course, even if you have a safety action plan actually that was created, you can still access this kind of data. You might not have understood that it was even feasible to do within cost constraints through a supplemental grant. So we can still support that work. And then lastly, there's the Reconnecting Communities program and the Neighborhood Access program, which is working to remedy historic inequities in transportation. So with over $1 billion in total funding and an annual cadence, the two sister programs are going to help states, MPOs, and tribes improve equity across their region while contributing to resiliency. Specifically, this competitive grant emphasizes assisting economically disadvantaged or underserved communities with planning and capacity building. So eligible planning activities include identifying, assessing air quality, monitoring air quality, emissions, going into hotspot areas or extreme heat, gaps in tree canopy coverage, or flood-prone transportation infrastructure, as well as assessing transportation equity or pollution's impacts. And so again, without a detailed understanding of what currently exists as part of the transportation infrastructure system, or just our environments as a whole, it's hard to remedy these inequities. So as Brandon had demonstrated earlier, heat islands disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities. Through creating a map of impervious surfaces and tree cover, it's feasible to demonstrate these heat islands and really quantify their impacts, and then develop solutions to reduce them and improve the safety and quality of life of all citizens. Or, since disadvantaged communities are typically those that must walk or bike as their primary form of transportation, understanding where they're located, what that connectivity is like, and how well designed these assets are is also going to allow us to identify gaps and safety concerns, which then can be adjusted for and these inequities can be remedied. So the SunCloud project in Arizona, although funded under another USDOT program, actually did just that. So by layering Ecopia's sidewalk, bike lane, and median vectors across the region with replica data, they determined how disadvantaged facility users traveled throughout the region. And then when they submitted their mega and infra grants, they had incredibly reliable data-backed evidence of inequities in the region, which is a heavily weighted criterion for winning this funding. And so while the SunCloud project used different funding, it shares the same principles of the Reconnecting Communities grant and could be a model that we follow as other agencies look to ensure that their transportation system is really serving all citizens. So we've only had a chance to cover 3 of 29 different programs. but we hope to have demonstrated throughout this discussion these are some of the most pressing challenges facing our society, and accessing these funding sources to begin developing a data system to inform better decision making is really the first step to overcoming these issues, and our team's here to support you through these processes.
So Abby, you mentioned a few of the grants. Obviously, in the time we have today, we don't have time to go through them all, but if people want to know more about funding, where do they go from here? Brandon, Abby, I'm assuming they can reach out to you too for more information and guidance on where they might go to get some additional.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think, for the scope of this presentation, obviously we felt it would be better to examine a few in detail rather than try to, go through every single one of these and just say it. Ultimately, the scope of this and the purpose was to highlight that there are resources available. And ultimately, geospatial data forms a piece of the solution that can fit into acceptable activities under these federal grant programs. We didn't even talk about NOAA's grant programs, FEMA grant programs like BRIC and FMA, the USDA, NRCS activities. Like, there's a lot out there. And ultimately, hopefully, if anything, I would say I hope this made you think about things in a way that we can help you guys get access to resources.
Thanks for that. It's time for us to move to the Q&A. And I guess I want to find out what's important to our audience. But at the same time, I'll throw the first question out. One of the things I brought up earlier is, I don't know about you guys, but I feel like we're at a paradigm shift in terms of how data is created. Data used to take months, years to create. Nowadays, with the inclusion of AI and some other tools, machine learning, it seems to me like folks should be looking at different ways to access and obtain data differently. Can you comment on that a little bit? Because I know that the time to create data is significantly different now with these new methods.
Abby, I guess I can jump in first. If you want to add any more, please do. But ultimately, I think you're right. As I just started off the conversation here, the shift is that geospatial data has historically been created as a service. You have one-time solutions, you have one-time data creation, it's departmental, versus where we're at today is geospatial data is shifting towards more of a commodity. It's becoming a tool across a variety of sectors, and there's an increased awareness of the value for it. In addition to that, modernized tools in terms of what we're talking about, AI, data extraction, deep learning, computational power that's available in terms of cloud software and cloud processing. All of this combined together has made it so that it's a lot more efficient to create data. And it's also a lot more efficient to maintain those data sets. We talk about, if you look at land cover, even some of these data sets that we talked about here, the historical methodology was, 10 meter, 30 meter raster data sets created at large scale. And the narrative now is, no, you can get access to high resolution vector data sets at a similar cost threshold, maintaining accuracy of a GIS professional, and delivered in weeks, not months or years. Abby, anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think just to answer a little bit some of Dan's point of just it being a paradigm shift, and it's changing what you have to do to procure this data is, I think what we always try to do with our clients, and what I think ultimately is going to lead to successful projects for any client in whatever use case they're doing, is really, what is your end goal, right? Like, what are you looking to solve for? And then working back out of that, because as Dan and Brandon are saying, there's a breadth of options and different suppliers and, synthesized data and real image-based data and all of these things. So I think when we can continue, while we have this access, and this is totally going to change how we can make decisions, it's always like what the end goal is, framing all that analysis to help make sure that really what you're doing in the end is going to solve your problem.
So really, if I'm hearing you, one of the takeaways for me is it really opens the door for another paradigm shift, and that would be changing from the notion of having to create your own data to really becoming a GIS professional that spends time on the analysis and the solution making as opposed to creating data. What do you want folks to take away?
Okay, I'll jump in. I think ultimately, in terms of the scope of this presentation, we want you to think about the concepts of geospatial data being at the forefront, but also understanding how geospatial data fits into a lot of these modern day problems that we're facing. When we talked about those modern day problems, climate resolution strategies, climate resiliency, or even data equity across communities, having access to up-to-date information is a critical tool in terms of building new infrastructure, building new models, but also making your communities safer, making your communities more resilient. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to bring to the table is that there are less barriers than what you would expect to get access to this high resolution data. And that's what we're here for. We're here to help not only to get you data in your hands, but also help you navigate to, how you're supposed to try and get funding for these initiatives, how you're supposed to leverage these data sets, talking about what other communities are doing. And education is a big piece of that. So hopefully you were able to take away something from this presentation that resonates and that enables you to think about geospatial data perhaps in a way that you had historically not. And ultimately, we appreciate everyone taking the time to joining us today. It was a really, really engaging time. I apologize we didn't have too much time for questions, but Abby, if there's anything else you want to close out on, please jump in.
I think just to extend on that point is, while these are very pressing challenges and we're feeling them a lot as a community, we're also better equipped, right, to do this. And this AI, what it can do for us is really exciting. While it is different and it's not our normal workflows, it's going to empower so much more, and really what so many different government agencies have long dreamed of. So we're really excited to support that. And I think this is really going to help just expand what can be achieved.
Thanks for that, Abby. I think one of the words you said there, empower, really indeed hits home, at least for me, as I think about where machine learning and AI can help us. Special thanks to you and Brandon for speaking today and giving us that great background, helping us understand vulnerabilities and solutions, and even a bit about funding. For those of you who joined us in the audience today, a special thanks to you. Hopefully you took away something that you can build upon as you think about where your organization or the role you might play in building resilience for your community or for your agency, where that starts and where you can go with that. So thanks again. Hopefully we'll see you on a future webinar from Ecopia.